Would you be surprised to know that two of the founders of today's biggest auto manufacturers both learned to fly at the same flying school back in the early 1900s? Maybe you'd find it more surprising to know that these men came from completely different countries, one from the USA and one from Japan. Or that one of these men started the company that created the airplanes responsible for the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Today we're talking about Subaru, the car that gave everyone the freedom to go off-road. Subaru's story doesn't start on the road at all. It starts in the sky as an airplane company, the Nakajima Aircraft Company. So it seems appropriate that our story of Subaru starts in a flying school only a decade or so after the man has learned to fly. The year is around 1914. Now you're probably wondering how a story about a Japanese car company can be started in the USA. The flying school is the Curtiss Flying School. It's owned by Glenn Hammond Curtiss. Glenn is having a tough time at the moment because he's being sued by the Wright brothers for patent infringement. They send a young and unknown Lauren Wright to spy on the Curtiss aircrafts and take photographs. Glenn isn't the only one the Wright brothers are suing. They spend years suing foreign and domestic aviators over the patent for their airplane controls. They want them to pay license fees. In fact, it's become known as the Wright brothers patent war and continues even after Wilbur dies and Orville retires. Some say this actually stalls aviation development in the USA. The Wright brothers' feud with Glenn Curtiss begins the day he demonstrates his flying abilities to representatives of the magazine Scientific American and the Aero Club of New York. Scientific American is offering a trophy for anyone who can fly 2/3 of a mile in front of judges. It has been 4.5 years since the Wright brothers claimed they took turns flying their aircraft to Kitty Hawk on the Outer Banks in North Carolina. The brothers haven't yet made a public demonstration, which is causing a lot of people to doubt they even did it. They reject the invitation from Scientific American, which is even more cause for doubt. But Glenn rises to the challenge, so in front of all these people he races down a horse track before taking his plane, Junebug, into the air. He's awarded America's first ever pilot license. This isn't something the Wright brothers are happy about, so I'm guessing suing him was partly about revenge. Luckily for Glenn, he has a good friend who is experienced with lawsuits. This man is Henry Ford, and around the same time, he's being sued by the Dodge brothers over the running of his own company, the Ford Motor Corporation. Henry doesn't want to pay shareholders special dividends because he wants to keep the money to reinvest in new plants. So the day after John and Horace Dodge attend Henry's son Etzel's wedding, the brothers file a lawsuit. Must have been one crazy wedding. But if you knew John and Horace Dodge, you might not be surprised. They are infamous for troublemaking, violent outbreaks, and love of drink. In fact, there's a story how the brothers beat a prominent Detroit attorney with a wooden leg and his own cane. Henry Ford and Glenn Curtiss have a lot in common. They both love engines, motorbikes, cars, and flying. Glenn makes his first internal combustion engine back in 1901. He uses a tomato soup can containing a gauze screen to make the carburetor. Both love auto racing. Glenn has won several motorcycle races, and Henry uses the prize money he wins at a motor race to start his motor manufacturing company. But it's their mutual love of flying that brings them together. Henry is interested in planes and attends Glenn's flying school where they meet and become friends. Henry isn't the only future motor manufacturing giant that attends Glenn's flying school. A 23-year-old young Japanese naval officer also gets his flying license there. He is the third Japanese to receive a pilot's license in the USA after graduating from the school. This man is Chikui Nagagima. He's a graduate of the Imperial Japanese Naval Engineering School and lieutenant of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Chikui also loves flying. In fact, just a year before, he piloted the very first Japanese airship. There are no records that indicate that Chikui meets Henry Ford, even though they both attend the same air school and have links to Curtiss. Chikui is 20 years younger than Henry, and while Henry's motor manufacturing company, the Ford Motor Company, is already successful, Chikui has not yet started the Nakajima Aircraft Company, the company that will one day become Subaru Motors. Of course, the men have a lot in common. Both their fathers were farmers, and they both have a passion for flying and for engine manufacturing. What we do know, of course, is that Chikui is sent to the United States as a student and observer of naval aviation. We know that he spends time studying aircraft manufacturing at Curtiss Aircraft, and during that time he learns to fly. We also know that he then starts the aircraft company that builds the planes that bomb Pearl Harbor. which hurls the United States into World War II. It's now 1917. Chikui returns to Japan and resigns from the military. He opens his own company, the Nakajima Aircraft Company, in his hometown of Achima. It isn't actually his intent to build military planes. His plans are to design civilian planes to fly airmail routes in Japan. There are 9 people in the company when they test the first plane with the U.S. engine. Sadly, it crashes straight after takeoff, as does the second. On the third attempt, the plane takes off but crashes into a ditch when landing. There's a saying in Ojima Town, too much paper money, too high a price for rice. Everything goes up except Nakajima planes. But finally, the 6th Nakajima Type 4 plane is completed and flies proudly over Ojima Town. A few months later, the company receives its first order of aircraft for the Japanese military. It is now 1941. Chikui is no longer running the company he started, the Nakajima Aircraft Company. He turns control over to his brother in order to devote his time to politics. He serves in various positions, including railway minister. He is highly critical of Japanese decision to declare war on the United States. He warns of the dangers posed by Americans' industrial strength, production capacities, and growing air power, which he saw firsthand. Now it's December 7th, 1941. A fleet of Japanese torpedo bombers manufactured by the Nakajima Aircraft Company makes its way towards the American military base on Pearl Harbor, a small island on the southern end of the island of Oahu. The Nakajima B-5N2 is the world's most advanced carrier attack bomber at the start of the Pacific War. In Japan, the aircraft is called Kanjo Kojiki, or Kenko for short. In English, this means carrier attack aircraft, although most navies call it a torpedo bomber. They are known as Kate by the Allies. Generally, Western men's names were given to Japanese fighter aircrafts, women's names to bombers and reconnaissance aircrafts, bird names to gliders, and tree names to trainer aircrafts. As they reach Pearl Harbor, 40 Kates attack, dropping aerial torpedoes and sinking 4 battleships: the California, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and Nevada. Another 49 Kates attack with high-level bombs, destroying the battleship Arizona. This is only the first wave. In the second wave, 54 planes attack airfields, each dropping a 534-pound bomb. The devastating attack leaves 2,402 Americans killed and 1,282 injured. 3 U.S. aircraft carriers are completely destroyed. The losses on the Japanese side are just 65 soldiers killed or wounded, and 1 Japanese sailor is taken prisoner. Japan had intended to destroy the fleet to give them free rein in the Pacific Ocean. Needless to say, they failed. 2 hours later, Japan declares war on the United States of America and Great Britain. Turns out the Japanese government originally intended to deliver the declaration 30 minutes before the attack, but the Japanese embassy in Washington took too long decoding the 5,000-word document. The attack comes as a great shock to the American people. The next day, the United States declares war on Japan and enters World War II, both in the Pacific and in Europe. The Nakajima Aircraft Company becomes a target for Allied bombings. The Musashi plant is bombed 9 times by the United States Army Force B-29 bomber. It's now 1945. Chikui's warnings of America's industrial strength have come true. Japan surrenders to the United States after the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Chikui is arrested along with all the members of the former Japanese government and held in the Sugamo prison for trial for war crimes, but is released on parole before his trial came to court in 1947. He dies at his home in Tokyo in 1949, only a few years before the company started disappears, then rises again as Fuji Heavy Industries, the parent company of Subaru. But let's not get too far ahead in the story. Now, the war has just ended, and the Supreme Commander drafts a law that breaks up the financial and manufacturing monopolies known as Zaibatsu, which forms the empire of Japan's military-industrial complex. This Nakajima Aircraft Company is identified as a significant target of the measure. It is divided drastically into 12 different companies. The Nakajima Aircraft Company disappeared. It's now 1953. My birthday. The Nakajima Aircraft Company, like all of Japan's aircraft manufacturers, has been grounded by the Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers. Hundreds of top aero engineers worked at Nakajima and other airplane manufacturing companies who can no longer build aircrafts. So they find jobs in the auto industry. Engineers like Ryoichi Nakajiwa, formerly the chief engineer of the development of the Nakajima Homare engine, he finds a job as chief engineer at Prince Motors and works on projects including the Skyline and Gloria. So if you drive a Nissan, the engine technology in some small way comes from aircraft engines. This isn't great for the airline industry, but benefits the auto industry in Japan. Actually, it's not only in Japan. The manufacturing of airplanes for the war influenced auto manufacturers around the world, from Ford in America to BMW in Germany and Subaru in Japan. Now it's almost 10 years after the war ended, and restrictions are loosening. The Nakajima Aircraft Company was split into 12 companies when the war ended. Now 5 are allowed to merge back into a new business. These companies are Fuji Jidosha, who manufactures buses; Omiya Fuji Kogyo, who manufactures engines; Usun Omiya Shario, who manufactures chassis; Tokyo Fuji Danjio, who are a trading company; and 5, Fuji Kogyo manufactures scooters. The new company is called Fuji Heavy Industries, and the first CEO of this new company is Kenji Keita. He realizes there's an enormous opportunity to manufacture cars. At the end of the war, there were only about 80,000 cars in operating condition still existing in Japan. So obviously, there is no way you could buy a used car in Japan. People are buying scooters, as they are less expensive than cars. But now, as the country begins to recover and expand, more and more people prefer the small, inexpensive K car. One of the companies within the newly formed Fuji Heavy Industries Group is Fuji Kogyo. This company is manufacturing a toy-like motor scooter called the Rabbit out of leftover aircraft parts. The Rabbit is actually inspired by the scooters used by American servicemen during and after World War II. Production of the Rabbit begins in 1946, not long after the war ends and about 6 months before Vespas go into production. It is the first scooter made in Japan after the war. In fact, it helps revolutionize the motor vehicle industry in Japan. It is so important that it is presented to the Emperor of Japan, together with its biggest competitor, the Silver Pigeon. Kind of wonder about their names there. Eventually, the Honda Juno comes out on the scene as well. Nowadays, the Rabbit is part of Japanese pop culture and nostalgia, even though it's not that well known outside of Japan. But Kenji wants to get involved in car manufacturing. He wants to advance from building Rabbit scooters to building cars. He is an influential executive in the post-war industry in Japan and is able to get the backing of the investors. So he begins to execute his plan to build a car. The development is codenamed P1. The prototype, the first car, is conventional in design, apart from a body structure that incorporates a wishbone-type independent front suspension. The engine is a 1.5-liter overhead valve inline-4 from the Peugeot 202. Kenji is happy. He decides the car should have a Japanese name. Subaru is the first Japanese car to have a Japanese word as its name. Kenji asks his employees for suggestions on a name, but isn't happy with any of their suggestions. So in the end, he gives it a Japanese name that he says he's been cherishing in his heart. The name is Subaru. Subaru is the Japanese name for the Pleiades star cluster, which is part of the Taurus constellation. It means to gather together. This cluster consists of hot blue stars that were formed together about 100 million years ago. If you look in the sky, you'll be able to see 6 of these stars, but if you look through a telescope, you'll be able to see a lot more, about 250 bluish stars. Of course, it's the 6 visible stars that are really important to the story, as well as the blue tinge, because that is the inspiration for the Subaru logo we know today. In the original logo, the stars were even positioned in the exact place you see them in the sky. Today, they are positioned in a more graphic way. Today's logo also takes its inspiration from the blue tinge of the stars. The biggest and brightest star represents the holding company, Fuji Heavy Industries. The other 5 stars represent the 5 companies that merged together to form it. Another interesting thing about the choice of Subaru is the meaning of the name, gather together. Unlike many auto manufacturers, Subaru doesn't really have a single founder. Sure, we talked about tracing the origin of Subaru back to the Nakajima Aircraft Company and Chikui Nakajima, but he didn't really have anything to do with turning the company into a car company. There also doesn't seem to be one single man or woman who started the merger of the 5 companies into Fuji Heavy Industries. So Subaru is really about a whole lot of people and companies coming together. Although some would argue that Kenji Keita is the driving force behind Subaru. The first car released is the Subaru 1500. It is not very successful. Part of the reason for this is a weak dealer network. But this doesn't discourage Kenji. Subaru starts working on the successor to the 1500. The project is code-named A5. It has the soon-to-be famous Subaru horizontal boxer engine. But resources are limited at Fuji Heavy Industries, so the car is not produced. Instead, the company releases the Subaru 360, a micro or K car. It is a huge success in Japan. It gets its name Ladybug and becomes one of Japan's most popular cars. It is also a car that takes Subaru to America. So how exactly does the little Ladybug get to America? It might be called Ladybug, and it might be designed by aero engineers, but this little bug can't fly. And I mean this literally. Its top speed is 60 miles an hour. That's it. The answer is an American businessman named Malcolm Bricklin. Now, Malcolm is an interesting character with a rather unorthodox career and some really unusual ideas. Some people called him a con man. He starts out franchising his father's Florida hardware store when he is just 19. Within 6 years, the business has grown into Handyman, a chain of tool stores. He sells the business and is expected to make millions of dollars. Unfortunately for him, shortly after the sale, the chain goes bankrupt and he gets sued by investors and loses the court case. So now he's broke and needs another idea. He comes up with the idea of opening a network of gas stations that rent scooters. He goes to Japan to take a look at the Rabbit scooter. He's at the meeting when he happens to see the Subaru 360 minicar. It's not like American cars at all. Cars in America are much bigger, but the 360 microcar can park in the width of the average American parking area. It gets up to 60 miles on a gallon of gas, but remember, it's the 60s, before the oil crisis, and oil is cheap. It's really just not suited to America at the time at all. Although some people say Malcolm is one of the first auto industry mavericks to recognize that thrilly, inexpensive Japanese cars could be big in the United States, he certainly focuses on the thrifty aspect. He markets the car in America as cheap and ugly. Not the greatest slogan there. But the real thing is that it's important to him is that the car weighs under 1,000 pounds, so it isn't subject to the same laws and taxes as a regular imported motor car. Even a nameplate 360 is based on a tax-limited engine displacement of 356 cc, so it's cheaper for him to import and cheap to sell. Malcolm gets an exclusive contract with Fuji Heavy Industries to import Subaru cars and create Subaru of America. 6 months later, he lists the company on the stock exchange and makes a fortune. Malcolm goes on to create some strange and interesting projects. One is a company called Fast Track, where he combines RV sales with a shopping center lot race course. People can drive one of 900 Subaru 360s. When this venture fails, he creates his own car manufacturing company and calls it General Vehicle. He manufactures the Bricklin SV1, a two-seat gull-wing door sports car. SV stands for Safety Vehicles. Bricklin introduced safety vehicles before the U.S. government introduces them as standard. The SV1 protected occupants with a frame, roll cage, and chassis that can withstand a high impact. The car doesn't even include cigarette lighters or ashtrays, as Bricklin thinks it's unsafe to drive and smoke at the same time. Now you might wonder what a guy that imports a car because it doesn't need to pass safety regulations to be so interested in safety. Well, maybe there's more to this. Could be he learns a lesson. Stay tuned to hear what it is. Or maybe he's just ahead of his time. Later he becomes interested in environmentally friendly vehicles, studies battery technology, and forms an electric vehicle company. And that's in the 90s. Even as recently as 2017 at age 78, he plans to transform high-end car dealers into high-end art dealers after becoming interested in the business aspect of art. But now back to the Subaru and Subaru 360. It's not good news. It's 1969. The Consumer Report magazine releases a report that says the Subaru 360 is unsafe and highlights how it didn't pass the usual safety tests. It describes the front bumpers as virtually useless against anything more formidable than a watermelon. Even the doors are called suicide doors, which is a slang term for doors that hinge at the rear rather at the front because they're seen as less safe than front hinge doors. The Consumer Report magazine has the words unacceptable written about the car in big, bold letters. Sales plummet. A car that is perfectly sensible in Japan with its high population density and small streets makes no sense on America's vast interstates, traveling next to giant cars with 6 and 8 cylinder engines, thanks to the country's cheap gasoline. It is like a toy car. There are rumors of Subaru 360s being destroyed or bought but never driven. This is the reason Malcolm Bricklin leaves the company and maybe learns a lesson about safety for the future. As for Subaru, many feel the car has doomed the Subaru brand in America. After all, how can any brand recover from a start like that? It's now 1969. The first Subaru car imported into America fails dismally. The Subaru 360 mini car sells only 10,000 units and bombs after the Consumer Report magazine raises concerns about its safety. Today, safety is part of the Subaru brand. Cars.us News lists Subaru among the safest car brands of 2020. In fact, even back in the 60s, when this happened, Subaru was ahead of official guidelines when it comes to testing. The 360 was subject to rear crash testing. Subaru is the first auto manufacturer in Japan to use advanced and realistic tests, including guide rails and crash test dummies. Perhaps lessons were learned. Remember Malcolm Bricklin, the man who brought the Subaru 360 to the U.S.? He goes on to manufacture the Bricklin SV, which is ahead of official safety guidelines. I guess he also learned a lesson. After all, along with reliability and speed, safety is critical when it comes to car manufacturing. Let's take a detour to look at the evolution of crash testing. Buckle up, because this drive gets a little dangerous at times, with concrete walls directly in the driving path and drivers jumping out of moving cars. Sounds like fun. When cars are first manufactured, all that is important is that they manage to drive without falling apart on the road. Nobody questions what will happen in the event of an accident, but as cars become faster and accidents happen, this changes. The first crash tests are performed by General Motors. This is way back in 1934. They take place at the Milford Proving Ground in Michigan. In the beginning, the focus is on the car and not on the people. They wanted the car to last. They didn't care about the people. In some tests, the unoccupied vehicle is rolled down a hill to increase speed. In others, the driver jumps out of the moving vehicle. Pretty risky, but better than hitting the concrete obstruction just ahead. That was their safety. You think you're getting in a wreck, jump out of the car. Then crash test dummies start appearing in the tests. This is around the 1940s. But it's only 20 to 30 years later when crash test results are made public as part of safety awareness. Seatbelts become compulsory for car manufacturers to install in the 60s, but they only become compulsory to wear in the 1980s. So it's a slow evolution in safety where cars are today. Now let's get back on track with what's happening at Subaru. It's the late 60s. The successor to the 1500, the Subaru 1000, is released. It's a 4-seater compact car. It's the first car Subaru produces in the compact car category. It's also the first front-wheel drive and the first production Subaru to use a boxer engine. So, what is a boxer engine? What makes it different to an inline engine, and what makes it so special? A boxer engine has the same 4 strokes as an inline engine, but the order of the firing sequence is different. The pistons in both a boxer and an inline engine fire in such a way to balance the primary forces. But there's a secondary force which acts on the pistons as they reach the top of the bottom of the cylinder. This force points up and out from the piston. In an inline 4 engine, the pistons point in the same direction, so the force causes vibration in the engine. In a boxer engine, since the pistons point opposite directions from each other, these forces are canceled out. This makes the boxer engine smoother, but there's a catch. Because the pistons don't align, they cause a rocking motion in the engine. While an inline 4 engine is generally more compact, the boxer engine has a lower profile. This keeps the center of gravity lower, which improves braking and grip. But importantly, it's easier to position the engine so that it goes beneath the passenger compartment rather than into the passenger compartment in the event of a collision. Subaru is so committed to the boxer engine that it's in every single one of their cars. Does anyone else use a boxer engine? Well, Porsche does in the Boxster, Cayman, and 911. It's now the 1970s. The 1000's successor is the FF1. It's marketed in the United States as the Star. The FF1 looks pretty much exactly the same as the 1000, but there are minor trims. The Japanese government has ordered a merger of Japanese auto industry to improve competitiveness. So, Nissan acquires a stake in Fuji Heavy Industries, Subaru's parent company. Fuji Heavy Industry helps Nissan manufacture a line of buses. In return, Subaru vehicles use Nissan parts. This is why the next evolution, the Subaru Leon, has a long hood and a short trunk, which is similar to the style Nissan is using for their own product. Leon means lion in Italian. It's a good name because this line has a roar which gets Subaru noticed. Why is that? Well, up to this time, four-wheel drive has been used mostly in off-road vehicles. Subaru changes that with the symmetrical all-wheel drive system. Once again, like the Boxer engine, this evolution has been driven by safety. The Subaru symmetrical all-wheel drive consists of a Boxer engine coupled by a symmetrical drivetrain with equal length half axles. It provides a balanced weight distribution and a low center of gravity which improves grip on the road. One of the first cars to feature this is the 1972 Subaru Leon station wagon. It becomes a great export success. People love all-wheel drive, and this feature makes the Subaru Leon stand out from the pack. It gets particularly strong sales in places like Switzerland and Colorado. Why Switzerland and Colorado, you might wonder? Well, what do these two places have in common? You're right, mountains. But it's not only mountains. People can now go almost everywhere they want. You can go off the beaten track and not worry about slippery mud and getting stuck. Today, all-wheel drive is synonymous with the Subaru brand in the United States, but this didn't actually happen by accident. It's now 1993. Subaru is struggling in the shadow of Toyota and Honda. It has released cars like the Legacy and Impreza, but sales in the U.S. are not good. In fact, it's only selling 104,000 cars a year in the U.S., down 60% from a few years prior. Subaru cars, with some few exceptions, are unremarkable and even boring. Americans found them exceptionally slow, too. George Mueller is an executive at Subaru of America. He knows something has to change. He thinks about what makes Subaru different from Toyota and Honda. The answer is obvious: the all-wheel drive technology. So he makes an important decision. Subaru pulls all front-wheel drive vehicles from their line and focuses only on all-wheel drive vehicles. He hires a new advertising agency, Tamerlan McCain of Dallas, and tells them to focus on launching the all-new Subaru Outback in America. The agency decides to use Australian actor Paul Hogan as a spokesman for the new brand. Paul Hogan is a famous Australian actor who plays the lead character in the movie series Crocodile Dundee. The story location is in the outback of Australia. The outback is a vast area with large parts completely uninhabited. If you consider that Australia is about the same size as the USA, but only has a population of roughly 22 million compared to America's 330 million. This gives you an idea how few people there are. And most of Australia's populations live on the coast. So if you're driving through the interior, it could be days before seeing another person, and if anything goes wrong, you could be a long way from help. What better place to test the grip of an outdoor all-wheel car, the Subaru Outback? It is a risk in focusing solely on the all-wheel drive feature. There's always a chance that Americans who are used to four-wheel drive in big sports utility vehicles and pickups might not go for it in passenger cars. Sales picked up. Subaru has created a new category of cars, a car-based SUV. It is soon imitated by other brands like the Toyota RAV4. It's 2018. Subaru sells its 2 millionth Outback in the U.S. It takes just 7 years to reach the 2 millionth mark, after taking 16 years to reach the first, which shows a growing popularity for this car in America. In fact, September 2020 is a standout year for Subaru America. They have 16% increase in sales compared to September of the previous years. Sales of Outbacks increased by a massive 51%. Now it's 2020. Since the Leon launch, Subaru has sold more than 11,780,000 vehicles, with the all-wheel drive roughly 55.7% of its total sales. This year, Subaru brings out the first self-charging hybrids. The new Forester e-Boxer and XV e-Boxer come with the added benefits of battery-based power without the need to plug in or recharge. It's marketed to people who want to combine the efficiency of a plug-in electric vehicle for city driving with the long range of outdoor driving. The gas engine charges the electric battery for time when you can't plug it in. Toyota increases their stake in Subaru to 20%, and Subaru officially joins the Toyota group. Most people agree this is unlikely to change the directions of the Outback, Forester, and Crosstrek. These cars are likely to continue their off-road trip towards outdoor adventures. After all, who'd want to change that? I can imagine an ad with a Subaru at night in the middle of nowhere under starry skies. And I can imagine the little stars in the logo of the car, a tiny reflection of the real stars of the Pleiades star cluster above. Hey, somebody else has the same idea. No wonder. A car, a long road, stars above. It sounds like heaven to me.